Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you had a good Easter break. Um, I am back with lecture 10. This is a lecture particularly on Hannah Arendt's work. As you see, I've entitled it Hannah Arendt's Critique of Human Rights. And the general subject that we're dealing with is the crisis of the nation state, imperialism, totalitarianism, and the end of the rights of man. Um, I'm planning on breaking up this lecture into four parts. The first two parts are going to be essentially historical background. Um, they're going to provide the shift from the middle of the 19th century, where we were in the era of industrialization with Marx, into essentially the era of the world wars, where when Arendt is writing. Um, you will need those two parts, which, as you'll see, jump back and forth between the era right after the Second World War, where Arendt herself is writing, and essentially the history that she tells about the trajectory of human rights as a way of thinking about rights generally, and what in her mind is wrong with that. So the first two parts are going to provide a kind of historical background, um, which is going to talk about a history of identity and rights as a way of understanding Arendt's critique of the idea of human rights. And the other two parts are going to be specifically about the text that we read from Arendt. Um, the first one, the chapter on the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man, and the second one on what she says about totalitarianism as a new form of government, as a government of terror and ideology. So we'll have two lectures essentially providing the historical background of talking about the transformation in identity and rights, essentially from the French Revolution until the time that Arendt herself is writing. And then you'll see why Arendt is so focused essentially on the question of identity, which is something that we've been talking about this whole time. Um, and hopefully you'll see why pitching essentially the history of the transformation from the French Revolution to the end of the Second World War in terms of identity um, might get at some of the larger questions that we've been dealing with in the course thus far. This is a pivotal lecture and week for us because in the first third of the course, we essentially focused on societies um, that did not think of innovation as a good idea, right? Societies that were focused on how things should be, uh, the specific place in which each person in society should occupy according to the natural or the God given order of things, so that any notion of something new or different would have been seen as going against that ideal order essentially of society. And then in the second third of the course, we have focused particularly on the society of progress and innovation. Um, this is a society that is still, in many ways, at the core of our ideals. Um, a society devoted to development, to innovation, to progress, to universal visions of humanity and of rights, of freedom and of development. Um, But the reason why this is a pivotal shift now, as we come to essentially the third and last part of this course, is that now we're going to talk increasingly about authors who are going to provide critiques of this society, this ideal that came into the world with the Enlightenment and with the scientific revolution and with the Industrial Revolution, these societies that we've spoken about. Now we're going to shift to see why it is that uh, these may not necessarily simply be pathways to utopia, which is how we've encountered them essentially so far, right? This society has been seen as a society that will precisely make greater improvement and perfection possible. um, and now we're going to look at what might be worrying about this conception of innovation and of progress. Um, has something gone wrong with this idea ever since it emerged in the Enlightenment and in the French Revolution and starting essentially with the scientific revolution? And uh, obviously, the history of the 20th century, which was the bloodiest century in human history, history really of genocides, especially in the first half of the world wars, makes you think that something did obviously go wrong. And this is, in a way, our starting point. We're going to be reading Arendt today. We're going to talk about the Holocaust and Primo Levi next week. Um, so, we're going to talk fundamentally about how this notion of progress and innovation should not simply be taken at face value. And having a course, for example, on a history of innovation um, presumes in some ways that we should just be celebrating this idea and kneeling down to it. Innovation is the all good. But the whole point of this course is actually to provide you a critical perspective on this idea. Um, and our own history, actually, I am trying to suggest to you in this last third of the course, is one that should force us, that does force us to think critically about this idea and not simply take it for granted as something that we should celebrate. So let's start with where we've been and then see essentially where Hannah Arendt takes us. So, first, we'll start with the Society of Progress and Innovation that we have been talking about in these past weeks, ever since we started essentially with the scientific revolution. And this is a society as we've talked about it, that the modern society, the modern world itself, the very idea of a modern world, that, as I've described and tried to explain it to you, was founded on two pillars, right? Um, the idea of scientific knowledge as something that is subject to growth and to progress. The idea that um, nature and society. And when we talked about Kant and Marx, perhaps history itself um, is based on certain fundamental laws, and that the more we know about this, it is not simply that we need to keep things the way they're supposed to be according to how God defined them or our vision of what God or the cosmos is, but actually that the more we know, the more we actually understand about how the world functions, um, the more we'll be able actually to control, regulate natural, social, and historical processes. And so, this is the way in which science translates into technological growth, into economic growth, into productivity. The more we know, the better we can make ourselves and we can make our world and we can make our society. So this is the first, this idea of progress and innovation. And the second pillar of that is then that the foundation, what makes everything in our world legitimate fundamentally now is not about some superhuman order that we're a part of, but that what makes everything legitimate is that it is our own human development, it's our human prosperity, and then it's the essentially the rights and freedom, the capacity for development and learning that defines us, that is at the heart of what would make our human institutions legitimate in this modern world, in this world of uh, growth of knowledge, growth of productivity, growth of the economy, right? So, a society of progress and innovation that is defined on the basis of growing scientific knowledge and that has its raison d'etre, that has its basis essentially our humanity, our progress, our perfection essentially of our societies and of ourselves. It is about a world that essentially becomes more and more human, the more that it's based actually on our capacity to develop, to create societies that serve us, and that on that basis are founded on our human freedom, on our capacity to create worlds that are of our own making, rather than being subject to a world which is not us, whether that is defined by God or any other order, right? This has been the heart of this society of progress and innovation that I've described to you over the last weeks. Now, as we've seen, it is not that this society of progress and innovation, this society presumably based on our humanity, on rights, on our freedom, of our development, the society that aims at making the world ever more human, it's not that there's only one description of such a world. We've seen a number of different descriptions of what this society is supposed to be. Um, and this society that is so focused on improving and perfecting, innovating in the sense of making better and better, um, featured thinkers who thought very, very differently about what the nature of that progress or that freedom or that perfect society actually is. So, whatever the utopia envisioned as the end of this process of development and progress, uh, different thinkers thought about it in radically different ways. So, for example, we talked about Kant's liberal vision in the Enlightenment, right? Where his focus, remember, was on a human nature, which for him was defined by our capacity to learn, and on that basis to develop. But for him, that was focused particularly on our competitive character, our ambition as human beings. And the whole point of human learning for Kant was how to take that ambition and that competitive instinct and turn it into something meritocratic, right? That's for him what our finding more and more about who we are, that's where it will lead us. Enlightenment will lead us ultimately to a world in which we'll have the public use of reason, meaning we'll open ourselves transparently to all the arguments about the best way of doing anything, and then the best idea might win. The same thing essentially in the marketplace, which Kant sees as that space of meritocratic competition, just like the public use of reason. And so for him, this perfection comes from competition plus learning, which leads to ever greater productivity and will ultimately lead to a society of universal laws, meaning a society in which everybody is kept accountable in the same way, and that will lead us towards peace. This was one vision of freedom and progress, of a fully humanized society, um, the Kantian one. We saw another one when we talked about Rousseau, the general will, and the rise of the idea of uh, national identity. Um, and here, remember, it was Rousseau's argument that fundamentally our human freedom comes to be expressed when we're able to create a society in which we recognize uh, the interests of others and see ourselves and our interests in the interest of others, and so create for the first time rights. And so it's only in a national collectivity that our freedom, our humanity can actually be fully expressed. And that's why, for him, ultimately, nationality and national sovereignty is the expression of our human freedom. And so human history is the shift towards this capacity for national sovereignty, popular sovereignty, that also actually, for the first time, creates and defines human freedom. Last week, we talked about Marx and Marx's very different vision of progress. Right? For Kant, remember, progress can only come through argumentation in the public sphere. Any violence is the very opposite of meritocratic competition, and so will never actually change anything. And Marx's argument is precisely the opposite of that, that fundamentally, uh, we are essentially defined by the economic mode of production that we live in. And in that context, for all of human history until the Industrial Revolution, essentially human society was defined by scarcity. Competition over resources, which required essentially one class of people to exploit another. And that meant that there was not even the possibility really for anything other than exploitation. And so the only way in which human beings can overcome exploitation is through violence, through revolution, through changing one system by potentially a radically different one. For Marx, the reason why we're at a point where we might actually be able to escape that vicious circle of exploitation is that for the first time in human history, with the Industrial Revolution and the growth economy that the bourgeoisie have actually created, we have for the first time actually created a society beyond scarcity. And for him, that actually means that even though capitalist society is fundamentally based on exploitation, it's based on the exploitation by the bourgeoisie of the labor of the proletariat, that a growth society actually makes that exploitation unsustainable. A growth society requires actually perfect prosperity because it requires everybody in the society to be able to take advantage of now the plenty that is produced. And when capitalist society, according to Marx, does not do that because it is focused on growing capital and on profits rather than on making sure that everybody can consume, this will lead to economic crises, crises of overproduction, which ultimately, according to him, will lead to the collapse of capitalism. And so the rise of a society that is focused on prosperity, is focused on consumption, and it would be a society then beyond competition in which everybody would do what it is that they individually would want to do, motivated essentially by their own desires to produce what they are passionate about doing, and then everybody in the society would benefit equally from the growth that would come from that self-motivated production. As you can see, very, very different visions of what progress means and ongoing. These are still the ideals that people in so many of our societies continue to fight about. When we fight about freedom and what is progress, uh, we are still fighting about many of these ideas, right? Um, in many ways, you could make the argument that this is still where we are. And if we take our world as founded in essentially the United Nations, right? The world of nation states that consolidates itself after the Second World War, um, you could say that that world was created at the time even by communist states um, and liberal capitalist states that came together to found a United Nations um, and declared a universal conception of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, as we talk about Arendt and what she says about human rights and the nation state, we can start in some ways from where we actually are, right? This is the world that we live in. We still live in a world defined primarily by nation states as the primary political unit in the world. And we live in a world increasingly, actually, defined by the ideal of human rights as a fundamental conception of what makes any political decision making in the world legitimate. Well, to the extent that it is an expression and forwards the idea of human rights. This is increasingly the dominant way of thinking about rights in the world, right? So, we're going to talk a good bit about this, which I think, uh, I assume, um, this is something that many of you identify with, believe in the idea of universal human rights. Um, and this was the ideal that was seen as one of the bases of this world of United Nations that came together after the Second World War. And so, by many, seen still as the basis of the world that we live in. So, in some ways, this can be seen as the fruition of that society of innovation and progress that we have talked about in these past weeks. In the sense that, as much as I said those communist societies did not really reflect Marxist thinking, but at least they were committed to his ideal. And liberal capitalist societies very much committed to the ideals of Rousseau and Kant, who come together and, in a sense, create this United Nations um, and this moral vision of human rights. So, uh, first, we'll talk about the Universal Declaration, um, what it means, what are the problems with it. Um, but then we're going to move fundamentally to talk about Arendt. Um, you see her here in one of her many smoking pictures. And why would somebody like her, somebody who was herself a refugee from the Nazis, who herself was stateless, exactly the kind of person that we would think the idea of universal human rights is for, um, why does she criticize this idea? Um, we want to discuss why Arendt talks about the decline of the nation state in the era of imperialism and totalitarianism starting from around the middle of the 19th century. I just talked about, you saw that map of the United Nations, the map of the world today, the world of nation states. Um, that world had not even been fully consolidated until after the Second World War and decolonization. So, why is Arendt already talking about the decline of the nation state um, in the era of imperialism and totalitarianism? How does that make sense? Why is she talking about the nation state declining when we think of our world as a world of nation states? Um, this is one of the first things that we'll do once we shift towards talking about uh, the chapter that we read from her in The Origins of Totalitarianism. We want to discuss why Arendt talks about the end of the rights of man. Why would a refugee, again, like herself, criticize the idea of universal human rights and say that it is a wrong and even dangerous vision of rights? Um, this is, again, one of the very, very, I think, surprising things because people today would have a hard time even imagining why would anybody want to argue against this idea. So we want to talk about that, and we want to see what alternative vision of rights does Arendt actually provide. Why does she think human rights, rather than actually moving us towards this universal human development, this society ultimately of universal peace that Kant or Marx envisioned, why does she think actually this is a wrong-headed and dangerous vision of rights? And we want more generally then to talk about why Arendt criticizes this ideal of human development and perfection, which is at the heart, like I said, of this society of innovation and progress that defines living in this modern world, in this world of the ever new and better as we think about it. Why does she think that this could actually, this idea of creating human perfection, is something that could become very, very dangerous, actually, that it could have a totalitarian potential within it. Um, we'll make that clearer once we come to talk about her conception of what totalitarianism actually is. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what I want you guys to do is to go to the page of the UN, which you had the website. I had it in the earlier slide, and I'll include it. I'm going to include a number of websites that you should look at, and I'm going to move to it myself now. Um, the first thing you see, it says negative versus positive rights.